Hey, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about Joe Franklin. You know, it was my pleasure for a number of years to know Joe, and he was a delightful, kind, and generous man who gave much of his time, much of his influence, much of his knowledge to everyone. And he loved to meet new people. He loved to push new people along. And I have to tell you, he was an extremely nice person to me, and he gave me a lot of wonderful opportunities. And I want to talk about him a little bit and talk about, some of the stuff that I recall about Joe. He's been dead for a few years now. I think he was born in 1926. He and his buddy, Bernie Schwartz, who later changed his name to Tony Curtis, grew up together in New York. And what's really interesting is that I met Joe back in the last century, if I can put it that way, and he was extremely nice to me. We sat and talked, we had dinner, we chit-chatted, and I learned. The amazing thing about Joe Franklin was he did practically everything, but nobody ever knew about it. One day I was sitting there with him and in his office. Now, his office was almost, if you thought about decoration, was by the Collier brothers. Now, for those of you old enough to remember who the Collier brothers were, you'll understand that. For those of you who don't, look up the Collier brothers and you will understand this totally. Because everything was like 10 feet high. Piles of everything. And I talked to Joe and I'd ask him about something. And he'd walk over to the piles. And he'd reach in the middle of a pile and pull out exactly what we were looking for. And I was like amazed. In my earliest days going to Joe's, I remember talking about Werenrath, who made a lot of records for Victor. Old Werenrath. And I loved a recording by him called Duna, which I think is so beautiful. And he said, "You mean Wally Werenrath?" He said, "Of course I knew Wally." And they used to spend time together. He used to spend time with all the great performers, all the great recording artists. When I was a kid, I used to listen to Joe Franklin and Martin Paint. And, of course, on the line would be Eileen Stanley, who did recordings with Billy Murray. And Irving Kaufman would be calling in and advertising his LP record, which he put out in the 70s. And, of course, there was Bing Crosby and his wife on there, and they had a wonderful time. They had the widows of Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, and you name the individuals, they were on Joe's show. Joe had an open platform for everyone. If you were looking for the unusual, if you were looking for the old, if you were looking for the unique, you found it on Joe Franklin's show. He was a staple on radio and television for half a century. Now, I got to know Joe I first met him, actually, come to think of it, in 1980 at the old-time music scene in Boonton, New Jersey. And he was looking for records. He was a big record collector. He was friends with Tiny Tim. And Tiny Tim was a big Henry Burr collector. And interesting. When you talk to those folks, you'd sit there with Tiny Tim and Joe Franklin, whatever, and they would be talking about, Henry Burr and all those other folks. Interesting thing. People don't realize that about Tiny Tim. They think Tiptoe, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. My voice isn't working right now. And, and I remember Tiny Tim would sing Henry Burr songs occasionally. It was kind of fun. Also, the other thing was that Joe knew everybody. If anybody was working their way up the ladder, one of the rungs of the ladder was Joe Franklin. Barbra Streisand. You know who was his receptionist for his phone for a while? Was Bette Midler. And it's interesting, Bette Midler became big, and then, of course, she was doing the baths in New York, and Barry Manilow was playing the piano, and she was singing. But she got her starts with Joe Franklin. So many people did. Elvis Presley was on Joe Franklin's show. Lots of people were. And, of course, I was on his show many, many times, but nothing happened. But it was a pleasure and an honor to be there and meet some of the fascinating people. I went to see Joe one day, and the widow of Bing Crosby was there. And she said hi, I said hi. We went out and had dinner, and we sat and talked about Bing Crosby all night. And that was fun. It was interesting because the thing is that, I didn't know a lot of things about Bing Crosby, and of course she was working on a picture book all about his life. And of course Joe had lots of other friends that would come by, and you'd sit and talk to them, and you would learn about all kinds of stuff. And Joe was always very generous with his knowledge. When I was sitting in his office one day by the Collier brothers, and everything was piled up, and you had to kind of walk between the piles. It was like going to Theodore Edison's home. Same kind of thing. Monstrous piles all over the place. And Joe was talking about various singers, and I mentioned Henry Burr. And he said, "Oh, I used to write to Henry Burr. We used to correspond to each other." And I said, "Really?" And next thing I knew, he went through piles. This is the amazing part of it. His room was filled with these piles of stuff, and he would know exactly where to reach. And he'd reach in this pile, and he'd pull out all kinds of stuff. And he had these letters by Henry Burr. I was blown away by it all. I should have made copies of it, but I didn't think of it at the time. He talked about when he worked with Marilyn Monroe, and he and Marilyn wrote her first biography. Joe Franklin worked with her on that. People don't realize that. That was her first biography. He worked on so many different things, met all the presidents, met all the great entertainers. And something, through it all, through all the years I knew Joe, he was a gentleman, wonderful, wonderful, kind person. There's only one time I ever saw him really get mad. And that was, I was sitting with him in the restaurant named for him, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And on the television came on Larry King. And I watched Joe, and he got angry, and he said, "That son of a bitch." And he said, he hounded me every week for work, and then when he got a job, he never even bothered to contact me. And that's true for so many of those that rose up so fast, they never bothered to come back. In his later years, toward the end of the 1990s, they created a restaurant called Joe Franklin's Memory Lane Restaurant. And it was fascinating. And I remember riding with Joe in a taxi one time, and we're going through Times Square, and there was this massive marquee with Joe's picture on it, and Joe Franklin's restaurant, blah, blah, blah. And he said, it's amazingly flattering to walk and ride down the street and see your image up there. Joe was truly a unique and one-of-a-kind individual. It was my honor to know him. And when they did open up that restaurant called Joe Franklin's Memory Lane Restaurant, everybody was there. It was a tuxedo event. And I remember, there was Tony Curtis. And it was fun to sit there and talk with Tony Curtis. And Soupy Sales was there. And it was amazing, you know. I grew up with Soupy Sales, and he was fun. He was a little hoarse-sounding, but he was fascinating. And lots of comedians, lots of actors, lots of performers were all there. Now that's all gone. Joe Franklin was a true New York original. And you know something? He was nice to everybody, and he gave, didn't ask for much. I can remember all the dinners and meeting so many great individuals, so many fascinating historic personages. You know, Al Lewis, and, you know, Sergio Fonke's widow, and Soupy Sales, and lots of other great people who were icons on television, movies, and the like. He's been gone a few years. He used to always try to drop by and say hi. He always remembered. He said, "Jack, it's good to see you." And he would ask me questions. He's been gone a few years now. But the memories are still strong, and I remember, and I wish to honor Joe Franklin. A true New York original. A great guy, a real person who got his start with Martin Block, playing the old records while Martin Block played the new, and he worked with Kate Smith and Eddie Cantor and so many others. He was truly one of a kind, and it was my honor to know him. Thank you, Joe, for all your kindness. You will not be forgotten. As long as this heart beats, you'll always be a part of me. Thank you.